Well, good afternoon and welcome to another Reliability Roadmap web workshop. My name is Terrence O'Hanlon. I'm the editor and the publisher at Uptime Magazine and ReliabilityWeb.com, and it's my pleasure to be your host and moderator for today's web workshop. This is part one of a two-part series on PAS-55 4.47, which is one of the most significant parts, in my opinion, of the PAS-55 asset management specification, risk management. In the PAS-55 framework for optimal asset management, clause 4.4.7.1 specifies that an organization shall have a process in place for the ongoing identification and assessment of asset-related and asset management-related risks, as well as the identification and implementation of control measures over the life cycle of the same assets. There are some good options for evaluating risk and financial impact to asset performance, such as HAZOP, RCM, risk AOA, and so on. PAS-55 specifies only that we meet its requirement to be compliant. In other words, it doesn't tell you which method to use. It just tells you need to use a method. This webinar is the first of a two-part series in which we'll discuss the PAS-55 clause and how it can be addressed. In this part one webinar, we'll discuss and explore examples of risk management processes, methodologies, process steps, risk registers, and strategies for managing asset-related risks. We have three learning goals for you today: that you get an understanding of the risk management requirements in the PAS-55 asset management specification, that you have a systematic process for managing risk, and that you understand the importance and requirements of risk registries. We're very fortunate to have Mike Schultz as our web workshop leader from the Asset Performance Group. He is a CMRP and an MMP. He's the managing director at APG Asset Performance Group and provider of implementation-focused asset performance management solutions. Formerly, he's a senior corporate reliability specialist and a 30-year employee at ArcelorMittal Dofasco. Mr. Schultz now draws on his extensive experience to help APG strengthen and refine its reliability and work ID practices, as well as develop and deliver education on the need for reliability and PAS-55. Before we begin, we just want to take a moment to remind you, if you have not already done so, to request your subscription to Uptime Magazine. It's free of charge. Just go to uptimemagazine.com, click subscribe at the bottom of the page, and you'll be well on your way. If you're one of those high-tech folks with your iPad, iTouch, or iPhone, you can just search the Apple iStore for that application, and you get a 2-year library of Uptime Magazine. We want to take a moment. We know it's nice and warm and balmy up in Canada, Mike, in December, but it also is down in Florida, and we want to invite you to come down to IMC 2011, the 26th International Maintenance Conference, December 5th through 8th in Bonita Springs, Florida at the Hyatt Regency. It's a beautiful facility. IMC-2011.com for more information. We hope to see you there. Without any further ado, I'm handing the presentation to Mike. And Mike, thank you for being here. I'm very much looking forward to this presentation on risk. I think it's an underutilized approach in maintenance reliability and one that's not well understood, so we very much appreciate you being here and talking about it.
Thanks, Terry. A great introduction, as always. I really appreciate your fine words. One thing that I always love about listening to Terry is you always learn something. First of all, we look very much forward to giving up some of that cold and ice for some fine weather down in Florida conference, so we'll see if we can put that together. Another nice learning is that, in fact, I do have an iPhone, and I wasn't aware that the magazine was available in that form, and I'll certainly be looking for that app.
Absolutely, and then we got to get you to write an article, and then you'll see your own article in that app.
That will be exciting. Thanks again, Terry. So we're going to spend the next half hour or so looking at risk management, as was laid out in the abstract in the context of PAS-55. Let's see if I can get this here.
Sometimes you got to go down to the lower left-hand portion. You see where the forward arrow is, the little graphic arrow.
There we go.
There you go.
Now we got her. Did that come through? Good. Excellent.
Yep, sure
Thanks,
does.
Terry.
Seeing you fine.
Thank you. The agenda today, I'm just going to go over sort of 4 areas. First, a little bit of background again around PAS-55, a bit of an overview of it. People come into these with varying degrees of understanding. We've been fortunate enough to work with the Reliability Web to do a bunch of these webinars, but if you weren't available for some of the earlier ones, we want to make sure that everybody gets a bit of a grounding in what PAS-55 is. Then also a grounding in risk management and some of the concepts around risk itself. Then we'll see what the integration points are and how those connect in the context of the publicly available specification, and a small summary. APG, well, we were founded in 2003. We're a large group of reliability experts, lots of industries. Terry touched on my background with our offices in Hamilton in the steel industry, but we've got folks out in Calgary and Vancouver and throughout North America. We really do focus on asset care solutions and have become a pretty key leader in asset performance management results, incorporating a global network of experts. We are, in fact, the first endorsed PAS-55 assessor in Canada, and hence the connection to this presentation. PAS itself dates back to around May 2004. It was first released with two parts. Part 1, which deals with the requirements of the specification itself, and Part 2, an implementation guide, which helps users understand what they need to do, were they interested in becoming certified. Assistance in that was developed in 2006 with an assessment methodology that assessors could employ and provide some gradient value back to the group being assessed and help them along their way to certification. Ofgem, which is the Office of Gas and Electricity Markets in the UK, made certification in PAS-55 a requirement in 2007. And so there's a flurry of activity in this specification over in the UK and Europe. I would say it's probably a little less known here in North America, but is fast becoming an excellent standard for what asset management should be. One of the biggest changes took place in 2008, a major overhaul of the specification that involved many different organizations across multiple sectors and countries. Somewhere around 1,300 recommendations were brought forward that resulted in the current form of what the publicly available specification 55 is. The 2008 version is the most up-to-date, and that's the one that we'll be dealing with today. Asset management is an interesting component as well. It is defined, or can be defined, as a systematic and coordinated activities and practices through which an organization optimally and sustainably manages its asset and its asset systems. There's a heavy emphasis on performance, and there's that risk word, expenditures, for the purpose of achieving that overall organizational strategic plan, and another very heavy emphasis on its life cycle. So often I hear the term reliability used. We see that all the time. Asset management is operating at a slightly higher level than that, and so some of the concepts that we'll deal with today, you'll see perhaps a little less in the practitioner level, a little more at the management of those physical assets. One way to describe PAS is to look at it in a bit of a pyramid, a scheme, if you will. We see organizational strategic goals at the very top. Cannot overemphasize the need and importance for the corporation to embrace the concepts of asset management. It is absolutely vital that they are the driver and the leader. And without their leadership, it will be quite difficult for things to be done, for things to be sustained or even implemented. The PAS itself operates at a layer just below where the organization and the corporation is setting strategy. It operates at the level of management of asset portfolios as a starting point. And it operates in a fashion where one of the first things that you need to understand is how you're actually going to break your asset systems up. Many asset systems are broken up in a different form. It could be the same product that's being manufactured, perhaps as an example, electricity, which is coming from thermal and nuclear and wind. In those cases, that portfolio could have dramatically different asset management or system requirements and could be broken up independently. Below that, we see asset systems, where we start to incorporate some of those key performance standards. We understand what the requirements are, the cost is, and right out of this slide you can see the emphasis, once again, as Terry stated earlier, on risk optimization. Risk has a very heavy flow throughout a lot of the documentation in the PAS, and that flows right down into the entire life cycle. We can look at the PAS in this fashion as well, where organizational strategic plans are flowing into any of the four main categories. The first one is an asset management policy. It's a mandatory requirement in the PAS that asset management has a written, structured, and well-defined policy that outlines exactly what needs to be done. As Terry mentioned already, it does not prescribe the how. It only requires that a good set of processes and steps are in place to meet the need or the what of what the policy requires. Below that, it's required that a management strategy be deployed that shows the direction, where we're going to take those assets, how we're going to deliver that organizational strategic plan, and how we're going to apply that policy. And that's paired very closely with objectives. What is the strategy and what are the objectives that you're going after? Measurable, where possible, quantifiable objectives of how this asset management system is going to support that policy. And then below that, we see the need for an understanding of the specific or discrete plans that will deliver that. What actions and responsibilities, resources, timescales, what are we going to do to make that happen? That overlying structure sits on top of the entire life cycle of that portfolio of assets. Can't again overemphasize the need to know and understand that those functional policies, standards, and procedures must begin right at the acquire, create phase and flow all the way through to the renew and disposal phase of an asset's life cycle. Risk management, as is stated here, is really a very critical component and is outlined specifically in Section 4 under Asset Management System Requirements, and we'll delve into that a little further. First, though, let's step back for just a second and talk about risk. What is risk? Risk has a couple of definitions. I could throw these ones out. It's perhaps the effect of uncertainty on objects is one definition of risk, or the idea that future problems that can be avoided or mitigated rather than current ones that must be addressed immediately. There is a way, if you are so inclined, to actually put some quantification to risk, and it's been shown and proven to be useful, that we could look at risk as a combination of a couple of events. A combination of probability, what is the likelihood that this particular event is going to occur, and then the corresponding harm, the consequence, the damage that's resultant from that event. By multiplying those two values together, if they were numerically provided, we could end up with some semi-quantified numeric value for exactly what risk is, and then get into the ability to do a risk comparison when we start to look at multiple events within the spectrum of what can occur. So risk management then takes that one step further. Risk management suggests that it could be described as the identification, assessment, and prioritization of risks. We manage risks first by knowing what they are, understanding what their impact will be, and then manage them by prioritizing from the most severe and extreme to the least severe and extreme, and follow up with coordinated and economical application of resources. We really do want to look at how best to minimize the most serious ones and monitor, and in other cases just control the probability or impact of those events. Unfortunate events do occur. We can maximize the realization of opportunities by managing that overall prospect, and that then is the method in which risk itself is managed and hopefully in some cases mitigated where it's severe. So I'll allow Terry then to flow through to our first question.
Alrighty. Bear with me.
Thank you, Terry.
Risk can be expressed mathematically as consequences times probability, or the likelihood of a serious failure, or consequences plus probability, or it cannot be expressed mathematically. Just take a moment, indicate. We'll see how well you've been listening here. We're going to give it about 5 more seconds. Everybody's on here, it seems. And we're going to go ahead and close and share. Mike, 92% said consequence times probability. No one said that it's the likelihood of a serious failure. 8% said consequence plus probability, and 0% said that it could not be expressed mathematically.
Thanks, Terry. Those are some good numbers. Yep. So just to follow up on that one more time, the mathematical expression is the product of the consequence and the probability, and in fact that is a pretty standard method for being able to provide a semi-quantified value of risk, and then of course that becomes very integral and important into the both its assessment and its prioritization, as it states here, so that we can apply those coordinated impacts. So excellent, thank you. 92 is pretty good. So the next series then, if we will, spend the next bunch of time going over those elements. First of all, what the PAS is, and then how risk management requirements impact into that specification. There are really 5 sections that I want to discuss today. Risk management processes, and Terry actually did a good job of reading that one earlier. We're going to explore that one a little further. The overriding, if you will, concept of what risk management should be about. And then methodologies that can be employed to support that. The process steps that need to be done to effectively manage risk. Risk registers, which we talked about in the learnings from today. And then lastly, the last section that I'm going to deal with today is the management of asset-related risks themselves. There are other sections within the risk management methodology, but I think, as Terry mentioned earlier on, we would be dealing with those at the next of the 2-part session on the risk management elements of PAS. So the first piece is the piece around risk management processes. It is required, and it points at the strategic level within PAS, it is required that an organization establish and implement and document the processes for ongoing identification and assessment of risk-related and asset management-related risks. The key to this one is this is almost certainly the foundation for a proactive asset management system. It employs many of the key integral components associated with cause and effect and understanding likelihood. So the mix between consequence and failure events. Information that the teams can use to manage risk to an acceptable level and provide an audit trail can be achieved by, first of all, looking or identifying what those risks might be, beginning to estimate the associated levels based on existing proposed controls, a determination of whether the risk level itself is tolerable. We're going to touch on tolerability again a little bit later on. Further analysis where required. Oftentimes results come back that seem inconclusive or incorrect, or perhaps once controls and other measures are put in place or changes to the business take place, a recalculation is required so that we keep our risk knowledge and understanding of events up to date. And then risk controls themselves, where events have deemed themselves to be intolerable, and how are we going to do that? At the end of the day, as I mentioned a number of times, risk management really is a very key element to asset management. It's used to ensure that the processes in place identify and monitor safety and environmental risks, especially when dealing with your employees or third parties and certainly the public. And it's just critical that it continues to be employed effectively in many cases where it needs to support legal requirements specific to that industry sector. The risk management processes themselves can be understood to apply where appropriate, in other words, where they can create value. There was a value discussion earlier in the slides. It's not just for the purpose of exercise. There must actually be a return to the business. And it needs to be an integral part of organizational processes. It needs to be embedded in how the organization functions, the concept of risk and applying risk management effectively. There needs to be a heavy emphasis on the decision-making component, and all of these are outlined, as I said, specifically in the PAS, and the types of things that we put consideration to when performing an assessment. It needs to explicitly address uncertainty and assumptions, what are in place, be systematic and structured. Information always comes up as being an element, and risk management needs to take what information is available. Often it has to be what you've got, but it should be the best available. There needs to be consideration given to the plant itself, how does it operate? What is it expected to do? And how does that impact the overall aspect of risk? Human factors come into play and need to be transparent and inclusive for all those who have an impact. At the end of the day, it is a key element that supports the continual improvement piece of a business and ensures business will move forward in a fashion that's acceptable to all the stakeholders. So those are some of the overlying principles in the PAS related to what risk management processes need to include. There's also consideration given to a methodology. The risk management methodology is not specifically prescribed, and Terry mentioned that earlier. It does not say in the PAS that you must apply this particular methodology to be accepted. However, it must entail or encompass certain key elements. It needs to be designed in a manner that the level of risk is managed effectively based on failure consequences. There needs to be a relationship between there. This is not the issue of doing a bunch of work with little return. It needs to be equally appropriate in order to manage the most severe risks first and some of the less likely or less consequential risks later, in some cases, if ever. The techniques and methodologies need to be performed in a proactive manner. This is truly risk management. This isn't looking at issues after they've occurred, but being proactive and searching those out ahead of time. Consideration has to be given to how risk can change. There's a number of different elements that can impact that. Equipment age can have an impact on risk and changes to the risk. Process changes, how that equipment is used, redesigns, modifications. The methodology really needs to take those elements into account and manage that so that the risks that are ever changing are also ever updated. There needs to be a classification piece where we identify the risks and identify them according to how they can impact the issue, the stakeholders, primarily again around consequence, with an emphasis, of course, on the attempt to eliminate or control them through an appropriate asset management objective and plan. So the relationship back to that previous diagram shows that it needs to be embedded within those elements, and is in fact a touch point to those pieces under PAS requirements 4.3.2 and 4.3.3, which is the requirements for effective asset management objectives and plans. We need to see consistency with the current operating experience and keeping that up to date, making sure that risk control measures are appropriate, and the ability to monitor actions for effectiveness and timeliness of implementation, another touch point to PAS-55 requirement 4.6.1. The steps themselves are fairly prescriptive and I think quite intuitive. A little shot up there on the screen so you can see them. At the end of the day, classification needs to take place. You need to understand the hierarchy. You need to understand the equipment base that you're dealing with, and this is another touch point to their requirement for a well-understood equipment location or hierarchy system. You need to make sure that the risks are credible, that they actually have events that can cause these particular types of consequences. You need to identify what the current risk controls are. That can include proposed or planned risks or activities, and certainly any of the existing controls in order to understand whether there's an effect there or not. We need to determine the level of risks, and this comes back to our earlier mathematical exercise, where we're going to look at that likelihood, we're going to look at the consequence for this event, and then we're going to try to understand what level this risk impacts with the effect of trying to put controls in place, be they both planned and existing, and whether effectiveness is taking place. And lastly, we touched on this once already briefly, the idea that we need to also understand that risk is inherent in everything in everyday life. This is not about eliminating risk, this is about managing risk. One of the key pieces to managing risk is understanding what's tolerable and what is not. So 4.4.7.3 talks about those process steps in a little more detail, and basically my takeaway from that is that you need to take care to be consistent. you want to ensure that there's a complete implementation of a risk management system on physical assets. And once again, that needs to take place across the whole life cycle. This is the only way to ensure that risk is managed, and one effective element of looking at it across the life cycle is that in many cases, if a risk assessment is performed during that design or even pre-procurement phase, it does provide an opportunity to make modifications. And I've seen a number of times where equipment has been installed and we've lost that window of opportunity after the initial installation takes place. So the emphasis within the PAS, not just for risk management, but for all elements, is that we have to look across the entire spectrum of an asset's life cycle. As well, precedents should be established when managing risk. We should do our best, as it states in 4.473, to look at elimination first. Try where possible to eliminate risk. But if that can't be done, can we perform a substitution or a physical control change to that risk? And then lastly, the least desirable, but often the one that we're left with, signage and warnings and other types of administrative or procedural controls. So there is a precedent associated with risk, and we try to employ it in that fashion. There we go, Terry. Let's see what else we can do with the questioning.
All right. The last step in the risk management methodology requirements of the PAS is to identify credible risks, classify assets and define scope, define the level of risk, determine the tolerability of the risk. Just take a moment to indicate. A little slower getting on this one.
This is a tricky one.
The last step in the risk management methodology requirement of the PAS is to identify credible risks, classify assets and define scope, determine the level of risk, determine the tolerability of the risk. Let me give it 5 more seconds. Got pretty good participation, a few foot draggers, but we did pretty well there. And I'm going to close, and I'm going to share. 0% answered identify credible risk, 0% answered classify assets and define scope as the last steps in risk management methodology requirements of PAS. 11%, though, said determining the level of risk is the last step in the risk management methodology requirement of the PAS. 89%, that's the single largest block answer, said determining the tolerability of the risk is the last step of risk management methodology requirements of the PAS.
Thanks, Terry. And as we know, answer D is the correct answer. I tried to make this a little bit easier by flowing in a natural state, the way in which it was described, that in fact identification is key, so is classification, and without a doubt determining level is equally important, and we saw that in that semi-quantified method using tolerability, using probability and consequence. But once all of that's done, then you need to step back and look at that tolerability and make that assessment. Hence, that is, in the PAS, the last step in the process of understanding. So we will move forward then into risk registers. Let's talk about those for a couple seconds. Risk registers are critical. And when I was throwing this presentation together, I was, obviously searching for some items on iPhoto and came across this one. So how does that look as a risk register? Isn't that the place to go to be searching out some of the analysis that was done in order to understand the true risk associated with a physical asset? So that's probably not going to be acceptable. In fact, we're looking for far more than that. We need the corporation, first of all, to understand what's happening here. We need significant risks to be elevated and classified. We need, obviously, some form of register system. And it could be paper. And nobody says you can't use paper. But if it's going to be paper, it better not look like that. It's got to be accessible. We need to know that senior management has had an opportunity to review. They, at the end of the day, are fundamentally and almost wholly accountable, especially from a risk perspective. If we had some discussion maybe a year ago when we talked about oil rigs in the Gulf, we might not have had the same feeling that we do today. At the end of the day, the CEO of BP took ultimate responsibility and accountability for that unfortunate accident. The risk was known. There's risk inherent in that industry. How well did those individuals review and understand and audit? And where was the register? Where was the information? If it was accumulated and collected, how was it stored? How was it referenced? There's a very heavy emphasis on the risk registries and the requirements to make them effective and utilize them effectively as a part of managing the overall risk. Equally important is once again that overriding issue of management of risk. Asset-related risks need to be looked at. Processes need to be consistent. That register needs to fit with existing corporate guidelines, and that would be something that we would look at. How accessible is it? The enabling of asset risks, they should be escalated where appropriate, where they start to show serious signs or items that have sufficiently extreme magnitude. There should be paper trails and documentation, a way of seeing that those were elevated quickly. They need to be identified and recorded in a way that's appropriate, taking into account all of those items across that life cycle, from the utilization to the different variety of consequences. At the end of the day, it is theoretically possible to provide a risk evaluation on every asset. That's not practical. Included in the overall management of asset-related risks is some thought to what's practical, what's appropriate, what's tolerable, and based on some of that quantification and analysis that took place, it may be decided that higher level risk items are the only ones they're going to focus on initially, then looking at medium and perhaps lesser may or may not be elevated to a control measure perspective. That's got to be shown. The PAS is reasonably, not reasonably, very interested in looking at an industry, looking at a company, and that company being able to provide from a policy and a strategy and objective perspective all of those touch points. Where does that register exist? What is the logic set behind what's tolerable and what's intolerable? What is your logic set behind how you're going to manage the techniques that you're going to apply, and do those techniques fit with the requirements of the PAS, both the different control measures and how they're impacting from elimination right down to signage, and then of course the step-by-step measures and whether the methodologies actually meet those requirements. So I think we'll ask the last of the questions now. Terry, please.
Alrighty. Here we go. When determining risk controls, this should be the first consideration in order to reduce a risk. Physical controls, signage, warnings, and administrative procedural controls, elimination, or substitution. So when determining risk controls, this should be the first consideration in order to reduce a risk. Putting physical controls in place, or signage, warnings, and other administrative control procedures, elimination of the risk, or substitution of the risk. We're going to give it 5 more seconds. And we're going to close and share. 5% say physical controls are the first consideration in order to reduce a risk. 5% say signage, warnings, or administrative procedural controls are the first consideration to reduce a risk. 89% say elimination is the first consideration. How do you eliminate that risk to reduce it? And then 0% said substitution.
Very good. That's good. So again, a reasonably high number on answer C, which is the correct answer. It is the most desired risk control, and the PAS focuses on it as the most desired control. In other words, make sure that it is the most serious element of consideration. It's not always possible. Without a doubt, the other controls are exactly that. They are effective controls. But if you can eliminate a risk so that it doesn't exist anymore, isn't that far superior to physical modifications that allow it to remain or be present, but perhaps barrier individuals, all the way down to the least desirable, which is just a sign people can miss, avoid, not see, now the sign needs maintenance. Keep it clean, keep it legible. The risk is still there waiting to reach out and bite you. So elimination is the one that the PAS wants to, we're going to look for to see if it's become the most serious consideration. There's a little piece in here about risk communication that I want to talk about briefly as well. This idea of 7 cardinal rules for the practice of risk communication. You need to accept and involve all those folks who have a legitimate say in the risk. They could be individuals who are at risk. Certainly that you're looking directly at your employees as folks that are at risk from your physical assets, but then there's a number of others. There's the community at large. There's other contractors and consultants coming and going, and then other stakeholders, even governmental regulations. You need to make sure that the risk information is communicated effectively and appropriately, depending on who they are, across that entire domain. Plan carefully and evaluate your efforts with a focus on strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We talked about that a number of times already, that the PAS puts a very heavy emphasis on the plan. What is your plan for asset management and risk management? Don't just say that you're doing it. Show us the plan, and it's been extremely prescriptive in some of the key elements that need to be in there. And moving upwards from that plan, the plan must contribute to the overall objectives of your risk management policy, which must be a key component of your strategy, which must directly translate to your policy. And in a PAS assessment or applying a PAS-55 type improvement technique, you're going to see those words over and over again. What's the policy? What is your strategy? Show me the objectives to meet that strategy, and what's your individual plan to make it happen. Public specific concerns are becoming fast and furious, a much higher element. There's obviously a key support of that in the PAS, the ability to be honest and frank with all those stakeholders is helpful and would be well received in an assessment. We talked about coordination and collaborating with other credible sources. Make sure that the needs of the media in some cases are affected, that they are brought up to speed. All of these items in a large way go back again to policy related to communication, but also policy related to those risk registers, that with that information in place, it's easy to speak clearly and with compassion. It's easy to find the information that's required when you need it. It requires collaboration and support, and all of that is embedded quite effectively in the overall plan. So the risk register is one of the places that we want to focus on during an assessment. So to summarize, to wrap this up a bit, is the first part of the two-part. At the end of the day, and Terry, you kicked it off beautifully. It's like you saw my last slide. PAS-55 has made risk management a critical success factor for effective asset management. You really must have a well-defined management process. I've gone over some of the high level, which is again where the PAS is written, the high level requirements as they pertain to those policies, strategies, objectives, and plans. And I've shown them to show that they must be compliant, they must be effective, the methodology has to be understood, there needs to be a clear step-by-step process, the registry has to be acceptable, management reviewed, you should be able to speak to management, they should be able to speak fluently about the risk policies and strategies and steps and know where the information is attained or retained. And at the end of the day, if you're moving down that front and you're able to provide some examples of that, then you're probably well on your way to meeting the requirements of the PAS. The question back to you folks is really, where's your organization at? And with that, I'll turn it over to some questions, Terry.
Terrific. I'm going to make a couple of editorial comments just for a moment. One is that, just to bring everybody up to speed that's been following this whole series of APG PAS-55 webinars, APG has probably in North America one of the broadest depth of experiences in PAS-55 and asset management of almost any group that we know of, and they've been active with the Institute of Asset Management since its inception, I believe. this standard, this specification, this PAS specification, is moving towards an ISO standard. It's going to be an ISO 55,000. It's moving very rapidly, and it will be done by 2013. The companies that adopt PAS-55 methodology right now, and some of the companies that I know APG is helping, they're going to be in a really advantageous position because it's not a huge revolution from PAS-55 to ISO 55,000. It's a very small evolution, actually, and they'll be fully compliant with that. Currently, it's certainly a great framework for asset management. We think it's going to become rapidly adopted and move quickly into the market space once it's an ISO standard. So getting an early start on it is going to prevent you from having to be back on your heels when your management says, why isn't our asset management program an ISO compliant program? Your upper management is going to become quickly aware of it when regulators and risk insurers become aware of it. So getting an early start with PAS is a great way for you to start preparing for what is coming down the pike. We think the ISO is going to be significant. So keep your eye open for that. I just wanted to let people know that. I guess the other editorial comment I want to make, there's a really great ISO standard on risk management as well called ISO 31,000. And I'm on the committee in the United States. I think one of Mike's partners is on the committee up in Canada that's working on this ISO standard, and we're referencing that pretty heavily in the new standard. Rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, ISO likes you to reference other of their standards when you do that. We do have a question here, Mike. With a person who's got PAS-55, but the old version, the 2004 version, and they couldn't find much of the risk scenarios that you were referencing, do the 2008 versions have more information on risk, and do you recommend that she get an updated version?
To be honest and fair, I haven't seen the 2004 version, so I can't comment on the differences other than the fact that there were 1,300 recommendations that were taken into account. What I would say, though, is that well done if you've gone out and had that in place in 2004. Excellent. It's certainly you would be well on your way to going in the right direction if you looked at the 2008 version and moved towards adopting it.
And I will just echo in there, if you're, Nancy, if you're active, if you're putting the pieces of PAS in place right now, and you're doing that throughout 2011 and 2012, then yes, definitely get the 2008 version of the standard of the specification. If your plans are later down the road and you're several years away from even beginning that journey, you could probably wait until you get the until it becomes an ISO standard. But it sounds like since you're already invested in the 2004 version, it would make a lot of sense for you to update to the 2008 version. We do a shameless pitch here, but we don't really make any money from it, but we're helping IAM because there you have to buy it through British pounds. If you want to buy it in US dollars, you can go to mro-zone.com and just click asset management, and they let us sell them in US dollars. But you're free to buy them from theiam.org as well. So mro-zone.com or theiam.org for the 2008 version. And also check out if I see you're well on your journey. All right. So get the 28. Also check out ISO. Go to iso.ch and search ISO 31,000. That is a fantastic. If you're interested in beefing up risk management, really, really good. Based on originally an Australian risk management standard, it's fantastic. So I would highly recommend that, and that is going to be referenced in the new upcoming ISO 55,000. Mike, one thing, and I know one thing I want to mention to the audience. You mentioned it early on. APG has done a series of these. I've actually lost track. I think it's 8 or 9 at this point in time. You can go to the APG website, or you can go to reliabilityweb.com, click on tutorials, then sort by the asset management category. There's a bunch of different categories. Sort by asset management. You'll start to see all the tutorials with the PAS-55 label in the title. All of APGs have that in the title. and there's 8 or 9 of them. It is like a college degree practically in PAS-55. So I would really highly recommend you go back and check out those as well. What's it like north of the border? Are you getting a lot of uptick and interest in the PAS approach to asset management, Mike?
We in fact are. It's you know, the word is getting out there. We're finding items or companies that are heavily regulated for obvious reasons. Once again, I'm quite interested in this, and I love your connection to other risk management standards, especially the ISO. Certainly, they're all speaking the same speak, and it is all about making these processes, these plants, far more controlled and avoiding some of the big incidents that we've seen in the past. So those are the areas where we are getting some draw, but we're also getting some random calls from other companies. They're interested in improving their asset management strategy. They're looking at methods to control, in this case, risk, but many of the other touch points that we've had around development of maintenance programs, uptime. It's all the speak that we've been doing for years, Terry, and at the same time yield some of those benefits on lower cost as well. And this is an excellent roadmap to get you on your way.
Well, and I think Mike's on a salient point. Companies like Mike and what Mike himself in his own personal career has been doing a lot of this, and over the past 25 years before there was ever a PAS. The concepts and strategies of asset management certainly existed. What's nice about PAS and the eventual ISO 55000 is that it kind of institutionalizes it in policy. And what will happen is if you go down this path, you'll create a policy document for guiding the practices of your company. And one of the themes that's kind of emerging from PAS, in my opinion, and ISO 55000 is that it creates a line of sight from the C-level suite or the area within your organization where the capital for assets gets deployed. And they have an idea in their mind of how assets should be operated and maintained, and then there's a giant space in between the reality of those assets on the ground and how they're operated and maintained. And by going through these formalized processes like Mike's referring to, these risk management processes and these policies and decisions that are going to be happening as a result of going down the PAS-55 pipeline, you will have to make that connection. In other words, the decisions will not be able to be made at the asset operator level. It'll have to float up to the asset owners, meaning the financial asset owners in the corporation or the organization, to make decisions, thereby making that connection finally between that level and the level where the assets are operated and maintained. And to me, that is just one of the huge values from this process.
Yeah, well said, Terry. And I've often drawn a brief comparison to my RCM experience that one of the big step forwards for maintenance and operations was that first question in RCM, just understanding what the function of the equipment is before we even talk about anything else. This is a very similar, or I could use that as a bit of an analogy to what the PAS has done. PAS is saying, do you really know what your policy is? What is the policy for asset management? You're asking folks to go out and develop plans, but you haven't given them objectives, you've given them no strategy and no overriding policy. So that's one really key element to this specification. And then the other one, as you touched on quite appropriately, is that the policy has to be developed by high levels within the organization, truly the C level in many cases. That causes them to have to be involved in the concepts of asset management. There isn't really any option now, and they need to provide that strategy to their teams so that they can be effective.
Huge value. This workshop is being recorded, and it'll be available for playback if you want to share it with your coworkers or the people who work for you or the people you work for, and we do highly recommend that. It'll be available at a link at APG's website as well as Reliability Web's website. Tell us what we have in store for Part 2.
Part 2, we're going to continue on through the rest of the risk section. We're going to be looking at asset criticality and how that impacts the risk calculation, how we identify risks. We're going to get into much more detail now than this, which was an overriding level. We're going to get right down into assessment, which is probably meat and potatoes of the overall risk management process. As Terry illustrated already, the PAS does not specifically prescribe a particular method, but it does list a number in the implementation guide, and we'll talk about how those can support your overall risk management strategy. And then lastly, we'll do a little bit of deep dive into use and the maintenance of asset risk information, how it can feed into other elements of strategies, objectives, and plans within your overall asset management policy, and look at those pieces as a connecting point back to the rest of the document.
Oh, that's going to be great. It's interesting, and I'm going to put you on, we have a few minutes left, I'm just going to put you on the spot a little bit, in that, you know, for years, decades actually, you know, it's been spouted that criticality is the starting point of a, you know, of a reliability journey to understand criticality of your assets. And what I find interesting emerging from this, even though it is not, as you said, it's not prescriptive and it's not descriptive, but it is requiring us to assess risk. I'm just curious as to what your take would be on, and I know you're going to talk about criticality in the next webinar, and I don't want to pull the rug out from underneath that, but it does seem to me that, you know, we are in business, or if we're in even if we're in a not-for-profit, a water utility or something, we have a mission to deliver, and risk plays a significant role in the realization of the mission or the profit or the value from those assets. You know, I'm just interested in your take as to risk as a basis, as opposed to criticality for a basis.
Yeah, good question. Criticality is a key element, and we certainly described that earlier in that semi-quantification of risk, because it is one half of the equation. It is the consequence side. It is without a doubt something that was looked at standalone in the past, and had a lot to do with how policy was developed, and I'm with you, Terry. I agree that was not the right path forward. Criticality on its own will not send our organizations in the right direction. Criticality does not change generally. It's a static value. This thing will always have this consequence should such an event occur. You make changes to the asset, physical configuration modifications, you make changes to how you use it, how you're driving it, what it needs to do. Sure, then you can see changes in criticality. But generally, outside of those changes, it won't change. What will change, though, is the risk, because we enter in that probability piece. We enter in the likelihood of the event occurring. And what we find is that not only do we perhaps not look at severely critical equipment first, because it may have an extremely remote probability, and thereby from a risk perspective we would look at something less critical first that's happening more often. But we also find that as we put our controls in place, and in the maintenance world, we don't refer to those as asset care programs or maintenance strategies, as those controls become embedded and executed effectively, we alter the probability of the event, and now the risk goes down. So risk is just dynamic. It's all over the place, and I think it's the key driving force to any kind of project prioritization, and or certainly just to understand where those risks exist. And many people may think it's elsewhere simply due to high criticality, when in fact it's not the thing that you should be focusing on.
Fantastic answer, Mike. Excellent. Wow, what a great hour this has been. I think that Mike and I would like to join to thank the audience for their time and attention and participation, as well as participating in the poll questions. We hope that it's been a useful 60 minutes for you, and I think the audience would clearly join with Uptime Magazine and Reliability Web to thank Mike Schultz and the whole team at Asset Performance Group for this web workshop, as well as the past PAS-55 web workshops that they've been bringing through the Reliability Web Network. Couldn't be more appreciated. These have really been an incredible journey, and we just can't say thank you enough for sharing your deep knowledge and experience with us, Mike.
Thanks so much, Terry. Really appreciate that. It's been great working with you guys, too, at Reliability Web, and your ability to give us the venue and the opportunity to express some of these ideas.
Well, we'll look forward to part 2 for sure. Again, we did record this. We will send you a direct link. But if you've missed some of the PAS-55s, just remember reliabilityweb.com, click tutorials, sort by asset management, and you can see all the past APG PAS-55 web workshops on PAS. And get an early start on it. I just cannot stress that enough. This is the time for you to be doing so. If you recall, when ISO 9001 was introduced, the Europeans had already adopted it, and when American suppliers figured out they were going to have to do it, they were back on their heels for the first 2 years, and we predict a similar response to ISO 55000. So the early adopters are certainly going to be rewarded, and that's why it's great that Mike and his company are out here talking about it already. So again, thank you. This is Terry O'Hanlon at Reliability Web and Uptime Magazine signing off. Everybody have a great day. Bye, Mike.
Bye. Thanks, Terry.